the Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel. Finales and endings.
This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Yeah. Thanks for the call, Dan. Thanks for the call. Yeah. No, I am reading the book. I am. Yeah, the chapter on finales and endings and closings. Yeah, it's great. It's really good. It's just, I don't think they're going to fall for it. You know, I did say it was the finale of the podcast. I don't know if I can get away with just claiming I was talking about finales. Yeah. You know, the last episode went really well. That's what, yeah. So you reckon if I just brazen it out, if I claim I was talking about endings rather than the ending, I'll get away with it? Okay, I'm going to give that a go. All right, it's starting now. I've got to go. Thanks, Dan. Thanks so much. Cheers. Welcome to the Age of Uncertainty podcast. This episode is all about finales and endings. All good things must come to an end, whether it's life, love, or agile products. Whether it's daily scrum to daily scrum, sprint to sprint, story to story, release to release, end to end. In Agile, we have this sense of closure every single day, all the time through the Agile experience, reaching a sense of achievement, reaching a sense of goal. I personally find that makes me very happy. And you know what? That's not just me. There's a range of interesting psychological studies on how endings make you happier. Endings help you stay in the present. If you know you only have a finite amount of time to do something, it can really help you focus on the here and now and not be caught up with the dreamy future. Endings also help you bring people together. The closure of an experience brings families, brings groups closer together. Endings can also help you let go of the past and focus on the goal. You know, sunk cost fallacy, where people invest a lot of time in something, so they feel they need to keep investing a lot of time in something. They throw good money and good time after this thing, now they have to throw more money after it. The famous bridge building metaphor we often use in Agile. Well, do you know what? If you have a sense of ending, if you have a sense of finiteness, that end's going to come at some point, it can help you get over this sunk cost fallacy, help you let go of that past spend and say, look, I've invested a lot of time in that, but no more. I've got future goals to achieve. So the psychology of ending is fascinating. Dan Pink's book, When, I find really interesting. I saw him speak about this at one of the Scrum gatherings a few years ago, when we had those things called gatherings, and I found it really, really enlightening. So I've been revisiting this recently on the concept of closure of endings. Dan talks about something interesting here about the anticipation of endings, because sometimes increase effort. He uses the example of reaching the classic nines, 19, 29, 39, 49, and the effect that has on people who want to run marathons. As they start reaching those milestones in their lives, they start wanting to challenge themselves or hit a challenge they perhaps haven't hit before. The idea that 39 you're far more likely to run a marathon than 40 or 41. The idea of raising effort as you approach a deadline. Now in Agile, we've always been very concerned about deadlines because of the amount of pressure they can apply on teams and how they can damage the experience. And actually, Dan does back that up in the book. He talks about there being lots of evidence around a damage of creativity to a certain extent, and definitely a damage of quality as you increase pressure near a deadline. But the facts of the matter remain is people do seem to put a bit more effort behind it as they start approaching that ticker tape. Could we use that in Agile somehow? In fact, are we using that in Agile somehow? Is that actually one of the unexpected benefits of things like time boxes? The idea of we're getting near the end, let's put a little bit more effort in. The idea of, hey, we used to say we are committed to getting the work done, putting a little bit more effort in. I think that could be interesting. A little bit of heat under our toes can really get us going. I know it gets me going, but I think in most organisational situations I see, too little heat is not the problem, too much heat is the problem. And so how can we better encourage that little bit of anticipation of the ending, a little bit of that helping us strive psychologically harder towards the end? Maybe endings would be a good way to look at that, whether it's story, sprint, or release, some way of approaching that finishing line. But with all that, we've got to make sure that heat isn't so hot as to crush us under the experience. Now, wherever you are in the world, I'm pretty sure you're aware of the concept of the Simpsons TV show. The Simpsons. Do you think it's any good? The Simpsons is one of the longest running US TV shows in history and has been sold all around the world for the last 35 odd years. But is it any good? Do you know what? It used to be. I remember those first few seasons of The Simpsons. They were fantastic. They were Emmy-winning, award-winning, the best humour, done by some of the best comedians who have gone forward to do much bigger and better things like Conan O'Brien on American TV. It was hilarious for the first, how many years for you? For me, first 6 or 7. But I haven't watched it, I don't think, in a good 15 years. The quality has come right down. Now, some people say it isn't terrible, it's just pretty standard American TV fare. So is The Simpsons any good? Dan Pink talks in his book about something called recency effect, brought up by Daniel Kahneman from his work. Now, the idea of recency effect is you are affected more by the things that happen more recently. So the idea is, like, he uses in the book James Dean as an example, the American actor. He had a few massive years in the 50s and then died in a car crash young, and so everyone remembers him as this great actor. However, if he had carried on for another 10, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years in maybe some American soap operas like Dallas or Dynasty, would everyone still rate him so highly? He still would have had those great years. He still would have been that great actor at that time. Just he would then have had 20 years of mediocrity. And would that have damaged his performance and damaged your appreciation of him? Well, probably it would, because those recent years play heavily on your mind than those past years. That long time of mediocrity has more effect than that short, sharp effect on us. In Agile, when we start thinking about endings, could it be about like a decay over time of a method? Something you've been doing in the past was fantastic, it really, really helped you, it really got you going. Then as you got more experienced, as you got better at the idea, that method sort of decayed away a bit for you, and now in your mind, the method is bad. A great example is something like planning poker. Planning poker for me is a great technique for new teams, but old teams often find it over heavy, overweight, and not very useful. But you'll see a lot of people at this moment online bad-mouthing planning poker, forgetting why it was good for them when they started with it. That could be that recency effect. They only remember the recent experience with it where it wasn't delivering value and don't remember the time that it was. Maybe recency effect could have the opposing point of view, i.e. that new shiny thing has a great novelty factor because it came along recently. And so the idea is that, ooh, it's lovely and exciting because it happened soon. And that could be a way of explaining perhaps why in our industry people seem to love to be chasing the next bright shiny thing and not actually doubling down on the basics, always looking for a new technique, a new tool, a new framework to buy, a new course to take, rather than embracing the fundamentals and doing them well. That could all be this recency effect, perhaps, and that could all have a huge effect on how we approach or how we visualize endings and closings. Here's another thing from When, the idea about good news, bad news. It's as simple as this. People seem to prefer to actually have the bad news first and then the good news last, yet a lot of people seem to deliver it the other way around. They put the good news first to somehow try and soften the blow of the bad news, but the bad news, the closing of the bad news, is hanging there like Damocles' sword. That uncertainty is fearful and terrifying. So the advice Dan Pink gives is to reverse them. Put the bad news first and then the good news afterwards. And that's what I've done with this podcast. I'm afraid to say I put the bad news first. This podcast is continuing. Sorry. So, if you want to get the bad news out the way first and then get on to the good stuff afterwards, why do most of us, when we have daily scrums, put impediments as the third thing in the list? Where have you been? Where are you going? And what issues do you have? Surely, under Dan Pink's advice here, we should use impediments first in that daily scrum. Hey, what's holding you up? What's blocking you? What's concerning you? And then once you've got that nonsense out the way, then we can get into the real useful info about where we are and where we're going. Dan Pink tells a fascinating story in his book about a psychological experiment setting up two metaphorical stories. One is a bit like Scrooge. A man has lived his entire life miserly, sharing nothing, giving nothing to charity, being poor to his workers, but in the last year of his life becomes very benevolent and shares money expansively. And the reverse story is a man who was like that their entire life. Very benevolent, sharing, giving to charity, paying their staff well. In the last year of their life, become miserly and hold their possessions and their money back to themselves. And when people are told these stories and are asked for feedback on these people, they tend to put actually more weight or similar weight on the person who's been a miser all their lives and become benevolent at the end, rather than the people who have been benevolent all their lives and become a miser at the end. That recency effect again. And so for me, this entire work in this chapter from Dan Pink seems to be about the point he makes that people prefer happy endings. People prefer stories that end on an ascendant or end on an uplift. I'll give an example of another experiment he talks about. An experiment all about chocolate. They were saying in this experiment that they were giving lumps of chocolate to subjects in studies. And what would happen is this. They would give a lump of chocolate to one of the people in the studies and they would say, "This is your next chocolate." And then they would say, "This is your next chocolate." And then they would say, "This is your last chocolate." And it turned out people liked the flavour and appreciated the last chocolate a lot more. The happy ending. So in the end, people prefer endings that elevate. So what can we do in Agile to bring that to our teams? How do we bring that psychological concept that people are happier with endings that elevate? Is this going to be something we're going to have to do with retrospectives and with reviews? Because it seems to me in lots of organisations, they can be quite down meetings. They can be meetings that are quite negative if you're not careful. And we're going to have to bring some positivity to them. Retrospectives, I feel we can do that quite easily. Reviews, we may have to spend some more work on. How do we bring those stakeholders together and make this a celebration, make this a party, make this, hey, look how good we are, let's see where we're going next, rather than a judgment meeting where the emperor is deciding whether those coding gladiators live or die. So, as good coaches, as good scrum masters, good agile people, bringing that elevation into those meetings may help add a lot of energy to this experience and make it far more effective for our people. Because in the end, we spoke about endings making people happier. We want happier teams. We want happier stakeholders. We want happier customers. So we need to bring that elevation into the experience. And now that means we're going to get into something that I personally love. Filmmaking. Filmmaking is fascinating in terms of storytelling, of narratives, and of endings. If you look at any Pixar films always have a happy ending, but there's always a little touch of poignancy, a little something that it was not necessarily the happy ending you were expecting, but still it was a happy ending with that little bit of bittersweet. People seem to actually enjoy endings more where there's an element of bittersweet. So it's on ascendance with a dash of sadness in there. So maybe that's the style we need to have with our reviews, like Pixar. Make it all positive, all constructive, bring a lot of positivity to them. Look what we've done, look how great we are, look where we're going next, and then treat that little bit of negative feedback as that little bit of bittersweetness to make that positive review all the more better. Now, I'm just saying this. I don't actually know how to do that. But then if I did know how to do that, I guess I'd be a movie writer rather than an agile coach. But I think somehow trying to bring that bittersweet aspect to reviews and make sure they're just not bitter meetings, which I see a lot of. I think that could be interesting if we could do that somehow, with maybe with a technique or an approach or just a tone. So now we're going to approach someone very big in my social circle. One of my friends from university, Richard. Now, I asked my friends from university the other day, I said, I'm doing a podcast on finale and endings, right? What do you think I could talk about? What sort of ideas do you think I can mention? Now, I got a lot of sarcastic references back, because it's your friends, but Richard, who's an accountant in Cardiff, came up with some really great stuff, by the way. It shows you should always go out and reach out to your community, the wisdom of crowds. So Richard talked about things such as alternative endings, director's cuts, redux, reboots and retcons. And I think we could all learn something from each of these phases. I'm going to put alternate endings to one side, because whilst that's incredibly difficult in movies, I remember the film Clue having like 4 or 5 endings, confusing everyone. But actually in software, in products, it's very easy to choose your own adventure and have multiple endings. But the other things he mentioned I found fascinating. Director cuts of movies. So the director and the studio put together a cut of this movie to make it the most sellable movie possible and put it out on the market. But sometimes the director's not fully happy with those cuts, and so later on they get the opportunity to revisit the film, maybe on a Blu-ray or now on streaming, and they put back in scenes that were cut out by them in the studio. A director's cut, often much longer than the original cut, and maybe I'm showing my negativity here, I often find a little bit indulgent. Now, there's been 1 or 2 good director cuts out there. I think Ridley Scott famously did a director's cut of Alien, which was shorter than the original cut. But most people add extra scenes in, and you know what? There was a reason those scenes were cut. And so they take a film that could be quite short and sharp and add just a little bit of fat to it. I think Apocalypse Now had a redux, which had more footage added to it, and it was already a sprawling epic of a movie. So we've got to be very careful here. Having complete creative freedom could actually create products that are quite self-indulgent. Products that make the director happy, not necessarily best for the audience. There's a phrase in movie writing which is kill your darlings. The idea is there are some things in your scripts that were why you wrote your scripts, things you love, little scenes you love, you think are marvellous. And those are actually probably the things that are most ripe to be deleted. Just because they helped you write the script doesn't mean they are taut and tight and help move the story on. Most movies extremely embrace the concept of MVP. They have very limited movie time to get a lot of information across, so they are ruthless with how late they start scenes and how early they finish scenes to try and make this thing short and sharp. Compare that to director's cuts, where they're a bit looser, or even things like George Lucas's special edition. So the first Star Wars film, when it came out, yes, it was rough and ready around the edges. And as we've moved away from 1977, it's looked rougher and readier. But that was part of its charm. And then in the late 90s, George Lucas revisited it with a load of CG effects that I would say, from my point of view, did not add to the experience. I didn't need to see a CG bantha farting in the direction of Luke Skywalker. That was not something I ever felt I needed in my life. Why do this? Why add to it? Well, you hear about painters, don't you? There's a famous story about a painter being caught in a gallery with a paintbrush touching up one of his paintings, and the security guards dragging him away saying, it's not yours anymore, you can't keep fiddling with it. And him saying, but it's not quite finished yet. You've got to be able to put down that paintbrush. Endings are important. Reboots and retcons are interesting in terms of endings. So you look at films, you look at endings. Some people reboot films, they remake films, okay? Is that good or bad? Well, are they saying something new with the reboot? I think is important. And are they staying true to the heart of the original experience? Those reboots, for me, they require a sort of sense of soul of what came before, but saying something new. Well, what have reboots got to do with us in IT? Rewrites. Re-architecting systems. We need to rework this system. The opposite of the refactor, the rewrite. When we rewrite systems, sometimes we play too close a homage to the original system and we add no value, and sometimes we step away from the original system too much and we lose the soul of it. If you think of your new system as being like a reboot of the old, the same soul, maybe with a new story being told or a new angle on the story, I think that could work better. What about retcons? Have you ever heard of the concept of the retcon? The retcon is when in comic books, let's say Doctor Doom's been killed off by Spider-Man. Well, the next writer wants to bring Doctor Doom back, so they have to retcon and come up with an explanation why the Doctor Doom who died was actually a Doombot, a robot, and the real Doctor Doom was alive all this time. A retcon sort of rewrites previous continuity. It strikes me a lot of the work we do in software delivery is retcon, retcon, retcon. It's not reboots at all. It's getting a story and adding a bit of a story to it, saying, but actually we meant, well, actually that never, and to get building, building, building. So what agile learning can we take from all this beyond retcon over reboots? Well, I would just say appreciate that having an ending, having a budget, having limitations is actually a good thing, not a bad thing. What is it? One of my friends, a famous Scrum trainer in Australia, Simon Bennett, said. He once said to me, innovation comes from starvation. The idea you have these limits on your experience and that forces you to be clever and creative within those limits. And some of these movie makers, when their limits have been quite, limitless. Look at George Lucas. With a small, sharp budget in the 70s, he created Star Wars. With an unlimited budget in the late 90s, he created Jar Jar Binks. So with films, it's really difficult. They're very finite. They're in the cinema, then they're out. They're hard to retcon, they're hard to reboot. If they want to bring back Luke Skywalker in a new Star Wars film, they're going to have to do a lot of retconning in that next Star Wars film. When in the world of product development, we're making lots of little things and launching them across the world, we have far more opportunities to retcon or reboot. But still, we have some issues around endings and finales. So another thing I love loads of, as you can see around me, is toys. Okay, boys' toys. I just haven't grown up, and the joke is, as I've got older, I've started to like this stuff more and more. If you look into the history of some toy developments, they're so fascinating in terms of product dev. Look at He-Man, for instance, up here. He-Man over here. If you look at some of the last toys released in the He-Man series, they were odd things, only launched in Italy. I'll put a picture up here somewhere, like these huge giant He-Men, only available in Italy. Or if you look at Transformers, which I've got over here, one of the last Transformer ranges I remember seeing as a teenager was actually these up here. Action Masters, which famously were Transformers that couldn't transform, completely missing the point of the product experience. And so as these products start dying, people start trying to innovate new ideas to keep the products going, and those new ideas may just lead them to an ending. So whether it's Action Masters or Giant He-Man or The Last Spectrum, you can see all these later products in their cycle don't sell much, the product line is gradually dying, and it ends with a bit of a splutter. Do you want to end yours with a splutter? Because we're so lucky in software. We have got no problem with shelf space. These poor old toys died because supermarkets and shops and toy stores wouldn't give them shelf space to put them. Yet in the soft world, we have infinite shelf space. Right? Look at other products like food. These things all perish. They die, they decay. Now in terms of the toy collecting world, even toys decay. The plastic is failing in a lot of these things. They weren't designed to be collectibles for 40-plus-year-old man-children like myself. They were designed to be short-lived products for a few years and then thrown away. So they're not designed to be surviving to this day. But in terms of software, our stuff could live potentially forever. And unless people are upgrading all the APIs around us, our software could have a very, very, very long life. A very, very, very long tail. And that's great, huh? Well, maybe. But how does the world end? With a bang or with a whimper? I see far too many product developments in our world fade off worse than the Action Masters and worse than those silly giants. Our products just decay down, the backlog gets lower and lower value, adding lower and lower value features to the shelves. till eventually no one's buying it. Should we actually be bringing endings that elevate, bringing that big bang ending to our product backlog experiences? I always prioritise my Scrum courses via importance of features. I prioritise it so the lowest value feature is the last thing in the course, but I always worry it leaves people going, oh wow, we finished on reporting. I'm feeling a bit low ebb. I've always wanted to have an exciting thing left at the end to bring people to a high, but my concern is, what if we never deliver that? So there is a bit of an issue here behind the idea of Agile prioritising high value first, leaving low value to the end, having a whimper at the end, comparing that to how people like experiences with endings that elevate. I don't think there's been enough work done around that space in terms of what we do, and of thinking of the last product having a big splash and then stopping, rather than just building sprints until we run out of budget and run out of people's interest, because you never run out of features. So that's all endings of products, but what about the endings of people? No, I don't mean death. What I mean is just careers, jobs. People have life cycles in work as well. I've been watching a few videos on YouTube of people who have been fired by places like Facebook and Google, and how they've taken that. For some people, it's been the end of their lives. They defined themselves as a Facebook engineer, as a Google engineer, and being walked out the company has crushed their sense of self. And some people have had the ego and the self-awareness, perhaps they're egotistical more than ego, but they've had this sense of self that's so strong, they're like, yeah, I was in Facebook, yeah, I was in Google, and now I'm out here doing something else. And so understanding endings for some people is painful. The finishing of a relationship, the ending of a job, the ending of a contract can have huge pain for people. We should appreciate that as well. People are always closing out their work experiences. If people get upset as their job closes, does that mean we have to be cold in work? We have to emotionally separate ourselves from our colleagues and be very atomic? Hey, I'm just exchanging my skills for your money. I would say no. I would say we just have to appreciate that all things pass. Endings come and endings go. Yes, this job may finish, so we must approach that with love, must understand that it's going to end, and then move on with happiness, without bitterness and without recriminations. That's a bit more the zen of endings, the zen of finales, understanding all things pass. So what did I say earlier on? I said we should end with some good news, building to a crescendo. Well, guess what? I haven't. The ending of this is all about just me quickly explaining why I was going to finish this podcast. I was going to finish it for 3 simple reasons: time, effort, viewers. The viewing figures on this podcast have actually been dropping extensively ever since the first one. And so if you look at some of the numbers on some of the videos before the last video, we were down to like 50 or 60 views a video. And I wasn't sure, because I spent 2 or 3 days on each of these videos, I wasn't sure that's a good return on my time, spending 3 days for like 30 people to be watching this. And in fact, I love data driving my stuff, and so it's well worth, if you're ever into YouTube, looking at some of YouTube's data, because viewing figures is just when they click and have a look. Actually watch the viewing time, and that can be even more depressing, as I saw gradually people were less and less interested to what I've got to say. So I thought, well, the interest is going down. Work, the good news is my work has been picking up hugely. Everyone's going online now. We've embraced this, as they're calling it, the new normal. I hate that term, but embracing having to work online. So I'm doing a lot of online training and coaching at the moment. So my job's pretty much back up to full time. And also, I'm still homeschooling 2 kids. Eek. They're still at home. The schools haven't opened yet. That's been difficult. Finding the time to do these videos along with a full-time job, along with schooling 2 children and looking after a house, with dropping viewing figures, all made me go, do you know what? I think this is a good point to finish it. But then the last video we did on safe, less, scaling, blew up, got 500 plus views. Everyone seemed to love it. And so I thought, do you know what? I'll keep going. I'll keep going a bit more. I'll keep adding some videos. I won't finish this off officially. But what I am going to do is sort of turn this into a little bit of a special model. So rather than do an episode every week, which is a little bit too much for me now with a full-time job. I'm going to do episodes as and when. Every couple or so weeks, I'll be putting a new episode out of something interesting. So later episodes to come, we're going to talk about servant leadership in terms of the product owner role. We're going to look into some agile myths. We're going to look at gardening as a metaphor for agile coaching. And we're even going to go into, because I'll tell you what, I had someone approach me and say, Nigel, your video on scaling was great, but you didn't give many answers, you just point out loads of problems, which is a good point. So what I'm going to do is do a video called Safecracker. And Safecracker is going to be all about how do we get Safe to be that transition model we want it to be. But that's an upcoming video as well. I hope to see you. And the only way I hope to see you is if you share these videos. Please share them. Please subscribe down there so you know when the next one comes out. Please like it on Twitter, like it on LinkedIn, or share them. It turns out the last video went really big just because 2 or 3 people shared it with their colleagues. So please could you share this material around if you find it interesting or valuable or just fun. That'd be really good for me. So it isn't the end. It isn't the beginning of the end. It's the end of the beginning. I hope to see you in the next special in the next couple of weeks. I've enjoyed this episode. I hope you have also. And let's say thank you to Dan Pink for helping me to find that happy endings are better than sad endings, and there are endings, not an ending. I'll see you again next time. Thank you so much. And now the start is near, and we draw forward.
Next episode, product owner, servant leader.